So welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is the Center for Behaviour Analysis, and today we are celebrating World Behaviour Analysis Day that was on the 20th of March. So with this opportunity, I would like to welcome Dr. Maithri Sivaraman. I know many of you will know Maithri and her work. So very briefly, Maithri is an engineer who turned behavior analyst, and she has worked with very young children with special needs. And she did her PhD studies in Belgium at Ghent University, and at the moment she's a lecturer at Cardiff University. So thank you very much, Maithri, for accepting my invitation to present for us today. It's a privilege to have you with the occasion of the World Behaviour Analysis Day, and we look forward to listening to your presentation. Just very briefly say, for those of you who are coming on board to our webinars today for the first time, please use the box questions that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And in about 1 hour, 15 minutes, I will come back on screen and we will have a Q&A session with Maithri. So use that questions box to put your doubts there. I pass it on to you, Maithri.
Thank you so much, Katerina. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be here today for this webinar. I saw in the chat that people have been sharing about the weather. The weather in Wales is quite wild at the moment. I'm not sure if you can hear the wind howling outside my window. I hope that it doesn't get too disruptive, but I apologize in advance if there's a bit of a noise disturbance. So first of all, a massive thank you to the Center for Behavior Analysis at Queen's and to Dr. Katrina Donovan for having invited me here. It's an absolute honor because I've had a fairly long association with the master's program at Queen's, although I've never been up to Belfast myself, and I intend to change that at some point very soon. I have had the privilege of serving as TA for some of their amazing lecturers, Nicola Booth, Catherine Story, Devon Ramey. If you guys are out there, hi. So yes, absolutely proud to be back here at CBA for this webinar. My talk today is going to be about why babies look. So I would like to zoom in on some of the functions of young children and their looking responses. I will specifically focus on social referencing, which is one of those early preverbal forms of communication. And I'll be looking at how we measure social referencing, how it can be trained to support children with special educational needs. This is a very exciting research area for me for two reasons. One is that I get to be around babies, and who doesn't like that? And the other is, I think it lends itself to grand questions, questions about applying behavioral principles to study and understand more about human development more broadly. And so I'll be speaking a little bit more about why social referencing is important for educators, practitioners, other professionals in support services, parents, and so on. But before I go into all that, I'd like to start by telling you a little bit more about myself. So I'm originally from Chennai, which is a coastal city in South India. It has one season all year round, scorching hot summers. Chennai is where I began my education in behavior analysis. It is where I certified as a BCBA and established the Tendril Center for Autism as a resource center for children with special educational needs. It was around 2016 when I had my first opportunity to attend the European Association for Behavior Analysis conference. And it happened in Enna in Italy at the time. I like to think of this as a life-changing moment for me because it was the first time that I was in a room full of behavior analysts. I'm sure if there are others here who are in, doing online study programs, you can empathize with that. It was the first time that I got to listen to some of the most prolific behavior analysts of our time, Doug Greer, Wayne Fukua. My mind was truly blown. But it also made me acutely aware of how little I knew about behavior analysis and about educating children. So I decided to, pursue further education and submitted grant applications for a PhD project, which was successfully awarded, which meant that I then moved to Belgium, to Ghent University in Belgium for my doctoral studies under the advisement of two supervisors, Dr. Herbert Ruyers and Dr. Javier Virues Ortega, two amazing scientists who had a profound impact on my career broadly and the kind of research questions that I pursue, the research methods that I've used. So much of the data, the empirical studies that I will present today is stuff that I collected during my time at Ghent University in the Research and Developmental Disorders Lab. So anyway, last year I successfully defended my thesis and moved to Cardiff, to the School of Psychology, where I currently hold a lectureship. And when I was putting this slide together for this talk, it made me realize that basically I'd spent my life moving from the sunniest part of the world to progressively grayer and grayer parts of the world. Perhaps not the wisest of decisions that I've made in my life so far. But anyhow, okay. So on to today's talk. Infants look for a variety of reasons. And much of today, I will focus on trying to understand and learn more and identify some of the functions of these looking responses. So sometimes children look as a response to a caregiver's initiation. For example, if the mother of a child were to point towards something in the sky, let's say, for example, a hot air balloon, this child may look at the mother and then follow the mother's gaze or the mother's finger pointing to locate this object in the sky. So there, the looking is actually in response to a caregiver's initiation. There may be other instances where infants themselves initiate these looking responses. For example, a child may look in order to get access to a particular item. So in this case, the look would function as a mand that is maintained by a specific reinforcer. There may be instances where infants look in order to contact a reinforcer that is more social. So let's say there's a child playing with a toy that has a bunch of buttons. This child may press one of these buttons that produces some music. And the child may then look up to contact the caregiver's response. So the caregiver, the mother or the father, might smile at the child. They may sing along with the music that's being played, make a silly face. And these early infant caregiver interactions, where there's a lot of back and forth in these looking responses, where the child looks and then the caregiver provides a response, and then that serves as a reinforcer to continue engaging as a dyad. These types of interactions have been described as an important part of early development, leading to subsequent language development and so on. And we'll talk a lot more in detail about all of this. So another reason why infants may look is when there are novel objects around them. So when there are multiple new and unfamiliar objects around infants, infants have been shown to look more towards their caregiver. And that brings us to social referencing. Social referencing is when, in an ambiguous context, infants seek and use cues from others to respond. So some of the earliest studies in social referencing started with this apparatus known as the visual cliff. It's much like the black and white image that you see on your screen right now. So infants would be put on this visual cliff, which was comprised of black and white squares, and they could crawl on this cliff. They'd get to a point where at the edge of this checkered region, infants were led to believe that there was a precipitous drop. So when they got to the edge of that checkered region, infants reliably and consistently looked at their caregivers. So if there was a mother standing there, the infant would look at the mother. And if the mother were to smile and sort of wave them along, the infant would continue moving in the general direction towards the mother. If instead the mother were to frown or look fearful, infants typically stayed where they were on the checkered part of this visual cliff. Some of them began to cry, some were fussy and wanted to be picked up. So after this initial series of studies where this visual cliff was used, more recent research has used a wider variety of ambiguous stimuli, ambiguous toys, for example. So a furry black in the room, ambiguous sounds. So a child and a caregiver are playing, and then a sound that appears from another room, the sound of a drilling machine, the sound of a hammer, ambiguous people, so strangers who are unfamiliar to the child walking into the room. So under all of these different circumstances which are novel or unfamiliar to the child, ambiguous context, children have been shown to reliably look at their caregivers, seek information from the caregivers, and depending on the caregiver's response, the affective cue either being, the caregiver smiling and saying something positive about this unfamiliar object, or the caregiver frowning and appearing fearful and saying something negative about this ambiguous object. Children respond accordingly to that cue. So they approach the object or the stimulus if the affective cue is positive, and they tend to avoid that particular stimulus if the cue was negative in some way. And children, typically neurotypical children, have been shown to exhibit or demonstrate the skill as early as about 1 year of age. Now, you might be wondering why is this important? Why is it relevant to study social referencing? It seems to be a very small niche kind of behavior that occurs under a very specific circumstance. But social referencing and joint attention have been described as important precursors for derived relational responding. So if you read the Hayes and Sanford study that came out in JAB in 2014, they argue for how social referencing and joint attention are some of the precursors for more advanced language and arbitrarily applicable relational responding. Bear with me a moment. I'll define, social referencing, joint attention, and so on in a lot more detail. But for now, the point I'm trying to make is that these early social behaviors have been shown to contribute to language development more broadly. My co-authors and I published a paper last month in JAB where we argue for how early infant caregiver interactions really set the stage for children going on to becoming truly verbal. So to an infant for whom much of the world is novel, is complex, they don't really know what's going on, these interactions that they have with the caregiver, where there's a lot of back and forth looking and jointly attending to an object, which seems to set the stage, which seems to serve as a precursor for some of the more complex verbal behavior that we would intend them to demonstrate later on in life. The other thing is that social referencing has been described as a foundation of emotional development. So it's one of those early behaviors where children really learn to discriminate between facial expressions, respond in a discriminated manner to a positive affective cue versus a negative affective cue, a positive facial expression versus a negative facial expression. And it serves as a foundation for some of the more complex emotional skills like empathetic responding, perspective taking, theory of mind type abilities, and so on. There's a paper that came out last year, a behavior analytics study, where the social referencing paradigm was used to teach safety skills to autistic children. So the researchers were attempting to teach autistic children to discriminate between a safe to eat food versus an unsafe to eat food. And they put that training within a social referencing paradigm where they taught children to seek and use cues from others when they encounter a particular food item. So it seems like it could be useful as a foundational skill that can then be built on to develop other life skills that might be very useful for a child. And even outside of behavior analysis, if you look at mainstream psychology more broadly, in general, social behaviors have been identified as key precursors to language development. They're strongly correlated and predictive of language at 3 years of age, at 5 years of age and so on, how well developed these social behaviors are in a child, let's say at 10 months or 14 months of age, is predictive of what language looks like later on. And so it seems worthwhile to invest some time and effort into understanding these early social behaviors and training them in children, particularly those children with special educational needs who may have challenges in demonstrating some of these behaviors. So an overarching aim of my research so far has been to gain a deeper insight into social referencing, both in neurotypical children as well as neurodiverse children. And so the way that I've, sort of put together this talk for today is in 5 small subsections. I'll start with providing some detail on the behavioral analytic approach to social referencing in terms of how it's defined, what are the characteristics of social referencing that we'd be interested in as behavior analysts, and what kind of theoretical discussions or analyses we are currently pursuing, and what is a remaining open question, and so on. I'll then move on to the neurodiverse population. I'll focus on autistic children in terms of what we know about social referencing in autistic children. So I'll present the results of a systematic review that we've conducted. I'll then go into a longitudinal study where we basically follow children from about 1 year of age to 3 years of age to look at how their social referencing skills kind of changed and developed over time, and what are some key factors that we might be interested in as practitioners from such a study. And then I'll talk about an intervention study going through some of the strategies that were successful in establishing social referencing and whether there were any collateral improvements, collateral benefits to such training. And finally, I hope to offer a roadmap for the future, identifying some areas for future research that researchers and practitioners might be interested in this topic. Right. So the first year of a child's life is a lush period for social development. There's a lot that's going on within that first year, particularly within the 9 months, the final 9 months of that year. So around about 4 to 6 months of age, children begin attending to faces, where they tend to focus on their caregivers' faces or people around them and their faces. Bear in mind that these ages are kind of tentative, so it's normal that there's a plus or minus 1 month here and there. And once children begin attending to faces, then they start pointing at things at around 9 months of age. There's a lot that goes on between this, so I've only picked some of the highlights of this development. Somewhere before they start pointing at things, they likely start responding to our pointing. So if the caregiver were to point at something, children track that finger pointing to the general region that the caregiver is pointing at. So that happens before they start pointing themselves. And once they're pointing at things, they also start following our eye gaze. So even if we're not using our finger to point at something, if we're generally looking in a certain direction, they're able to kind of track the way that our head is oriented to identify the location or the object that we're looking at. And then subsequent to that, somewhere around 1 year, so 12 months of age, children begin to exhibit social referencing. So there's a lot that seems to be going on within that 9 to 12 months of age. And there's really not very solid evidence in terms of, what comes first. Do they start pointing at things first? Can they demonstrate social referencing maybe a couple of weeks before they start pointing? So that part is a little bit murky still. But basically, they all seem to come up at around about the same time of nearly 1 year of age. And all of this pre-verbal social development happens before children start showing rudimentary forms of conversational speech. So before, at around 18 months of age, we see some rudimentary conversational speech in the sense that children are able to say a few words, maybe a phrase or two, and they start showing some understanding of turn taking between listener and speaker roles. So they may not be able to fully have a discussion about a topic elaborately, but around 18 months of age, they seem to understand that when they say something, the caregiver may respond, and then that's an opportunity for them to say something else again, and so on. So before any of that rudimentary conversational speech starts to happen, we're seeing a lot of these pre-verbal social behaviors emerge. And technically, each of these have technical terms within psychology. For example, pointing at things in mainstream psychology would be described as a form of initiating joint attention. Following somebody's eye gaze or following somebody's finger pointing would be described as responding to joint attention, and social referencing, of course. So what I'd like to do next is look a little bit more closely into joint attention and social referencing from a behavior analytic point of view. So the joint attention paradigm, I'd basically just put it together as a flow chart of sorts. So when an interesting event occurs, so the interesting event can be something that's motivating to the child in some way. Typically, it's probably a toy, most likely a toy if, for example, you're engaged in playing with the child. And when we do this in a laboratory kind of setting, we typically tend to use wind-up toys like the frog that you see on screen. It's one that I've used multiple times in my own research. So when we wind up that frog, it tends to do a bunch of different stuff. It jumps around, it somersaults, and it's quite fun to watch. And so when this frog, is doing its fun sort of movement or whatever, in the context of that event, children may look at a caregiver. So a child may look at a caregiver, and the caregiver may respond to that child's looking response by saying, oh, wow, that's a nice frog, or saying something else about the frog. So the caregiver's response essentially serves as a conditioned reinforcer for the child's looking response. And you may, in the natural environment, if you were to observe this happening in real life, you may see this happen a few times over and over again. So the child looks, the caregiver may say something, and that serves as a reinforcer for this chain to kind of keep happening over and over again. So the child may look again, and the caregiver may say something else about the frog. And that basically serves as the reinforcer for the child and the caregiver to serve as a dyad. So these instances of looking where the child initiates a response in the presence of an interesting or motivating event would be described as initiating joint attention. It's initiating because it's the child who's initiating the response, and the child and the caregiver are jointly attending to this interesting event, which in this case would be a frog. Now, the social referencing paradigm looks similar, but also different in important ways. So first up, it's set off by an ambiguous event rather than an interesting event. So the difference would be that this is something that the child is uncertain about, maybe unfamiliar or novel in some way for the child. So in the presence of this ambiguous event, which in this case, let's say, is a slightly strange looking robot that enters the room, the child may initiate a looking response. The child looks at the caregiver. Usually in such instances, the caregiver follows that response with an affective cue. So the cue could either be the caregiver saying, oh, that's nice, it's a robot, or the cue could be the caregiver saying, oh my God, that's nasty, stay away. So it could be either a positive cue or a negative cue. But critically, the cue serves as a conditioned reinforcer again for the initiation response, so for the looking response. But it also serves as an SD for the subsequent response. So it serves as a discriminative stimulus for the subsequent response, in that it serves as a signal for the child to determine how to respond subsequently. So a positive affective cue would mean that the child approaches this item, and a negative affective cue would mean that the child avoids this item or stays away from this item. And that response is what we would call a discrimination response. And the discrimination response results in some event-related consequences. So the child may approach the robot and play with the robot, end up having fun in the presence of the caregiver's affective cue. And so therefore, there are positive consequences that are associated with that event. approaching this object in the presence of the negative affective cue might lead to aversive consequences. In the real world, I think if it were really a nasty, stimulus in the room, the caregiver is likely to pick up the child and kind of move away from that spot. So basically, the event-related consequences are what end this chain. And so, as you may probably notice by now, there are important similarities and key differences between social referencing and joint attention. The differences are that, first of all, social referencing is a chain that's comprised of two responses. There's an initiation response and a discrimination response. And it's set off by an ambiguous stimulus, a stimulus that is uncertain or novel to the child. The similarities are in the topography. So if you look at the initiation response alone, both of these behaviors basically are the same. In both of these, circumstances, contexts, the child is basically looking at the caregiver. But even though the topographical similarities are there, the functions of both these behaviors are quite different. In the former, that is in the case of joint attention, the function is likely to share interest, share attention. It's almost like the child saying, do you see what I see? Isn't this fun? Or something like that, if the child could speak at that instance. Whereas the function of social referencing is more to disambiguate, in the sense that there's something uncertain about this event, and let me see how my caregiver feels about this. Now, you may be wondering, this is a very sort of, nerdy exercise. Why would someone want to go into this amount of detail to kind of try and understand what the differences between joint attention and social referencing are? And if you've ever sort of played with a child, a young baby, you might be thinking, there really is no time to go into details about what was the antecedent that set it off and what's the consequence, and is this a chain comprised of one behavior or two behaviors? Critically, however, there's some research that's been done into the types of consequences that we provide to babies and the impact that those consequences have. So it's a very interesting study where researchers basically compared two types of conditions. In condition one, they simply followed a child's looking response with a positive statement. So it could have been something like, oh, wow, oh, that's nice. So in condition A, looking responses were always consistently followed by a general positive statement. Whereas in condition B, researchers provided information about this object. So if the child initiated a looking response and there was a frog in the vicinity or a robot in the vicinity, caregivers provided some information about that object to say, look, that's a yellow robot. Oh, that's nice. It's a yellow robot. And in condition B, when the consequence offered some information about the situation, the looking responses increased. So the reinforcing value of those types of consequences seem to be higher than simply following a child's looking response with a positive statement where we engage with the child. So while social engagement serves as a condition reinforcer, the type of statements that we use, the type of consequences that we provide, and the information that we provide within that social engagement context seems to make a difference to children's looking responses. So in general, for a behavior analytic approach to social referencing, the summary is that there are multiple topographical similarities between social referencing and joint attention. And so it may be worthwhile to simply adopt functional definitions that gives us a lot more control rather than rely on the topography where in all of these instances, the child likely looks at a caregiver. So one example of a functional definition that we've adopted in our research is for social referencing is a behavior chain that's comprised of an initiation response that occurs under specific stimulus conditions, example, uncertainty or ambiguity, which brings the individual in contact with social cues that influence subsequent responding towards the initial ambiguous stimulus. So this is just one example. It's by no means, a comprehensive or the ideal example, but we've found it worthwhile in a lot of the empirical research that we've carried out within social referencing. The other thing we might want to inquire into for a theoretical type of analysis is whether the antecedent event that sets off the chain, that is the social referencing chain, is it a motivating operation or a discriminative stimulus? So is it an MO or an ST? This is up for debate, but I would argue that it is a motivating operation because the caregiver's attention is likely available throughout, but in the presence of the novel stimulus, the value of the caregiver's attention or cues from the caregiver increases. And so therefore, the ambiguous event likely serves as a motivating operation rather than a discriminative stimulus. The other thing that we'd be interested as behavior analysts is to look at whether what explains this behavior. So what are the processes underlying social referencing? And stimulus discrimination seems to be an important core concept of social referencing because after that initiation response, the child really has to discriminate between two types of cues to say, if it's a positive cue, then I can approach that, and approaching leads to, let's say, positive event-related consequences. But if there's a negative cue, then that negative cue really serves as a signal to avoid that particular stimulus. And so stimulus discrimination seems really to be at the heart of social referencing. And we've used some of this sort of theoretical analysis in the empirical studies that we've conducted, and I'll walk you through some of that in this next section. So in the next section, what I'm going to do is go into some of the empirical research. And so I'd like to start with a bit of a background on autism spectrum disorder, because the samples that we've used in the empirical studies are predominantly autistic children. So as defined by the DSM, autism is a neurodevelopmental condition that is characterized by reduced social communication and restricted repetitive behaviors. In the general population, the prevalence is estimated to be somewhere between 0.6 to 2%. So there are, worldwide variations by geographical region, with some regions reporting a slightly higher prevalence compared to others. But broadly, world over, I think the prevalence is estimated to be at about 1%. But there are some groups where there's an elevated likelihood for autism. And one such group is the younger siblings of autistic children. So these are the younger brothers or the younger sisters of children who have a confirmed diagnosis of autism. Within this group, the prevalence is estimated to be higher in that it is about 10 to 20%. There's another group, a third group, and this is also a group with an elevated likelihood, which is preterm born children. So these are children born with a gestational age of less than 32 weeks. And in this group, the prevalence is approximately 6%. Now, the reason I'm talking about this, the elevated likelihood groups is one, yes, there's a higher prevalence of autism within these groups, but also that they represent an important group for investigations because it gives us an avenue to understand autistic children and autistic people more broadly and look for developmental pathways that are somewhat different from the neurotypical children. So whether social referencing, looks different, has multiple other topographies within the autistic children, or if there are differences in social referencing broadly between neurotypical children and neurodiverse children. So one of the first things that we did is to try and gain some insight into what we really know so far about social referencing. And so we started with a systematic review of previous research on social referencing, particularly within autism spectrum disorder, so autistic children, autistic individuals. This study was published in 2020 in Research in Autism Spectrum Disorders. It's a systematic literature review, and we ended up including 8 studies. So at the outset, when we began our literature search, we really expected there to be a lot more studies than we ended up finding. So we did end up with only 8 studies, and this was across all types of psychological perspectives and behavior analysis and so on. So it was quite a diverse range within those 8 studies. And our aims were fourfold. We were interested in how social referencing was defined, what are some of the different ways in which social referencing was measured, tested, the types of stimulus conditions under which the observations were made. We were interested, of course, in the overall outcome. So what was the overall level of social referencing among autistic children, and whether there had been any sort of inquiry into the behavioral processes underlying social referencing, and whether there was some kind of data on, for example, stimulus discrimination within this population in the context of social referencing. And one common theme that sort of emerged across all these 4 aims was that there was wide variation. So in terms of the definition, there was very wide variation. Some studies only looked at one component of social referencing. So they only looked at the initiation component, didn't really look at the discrimination component. There were some studies which basically defined social referencing and joint attention in the exact same way. So there was quite some variation in the definition. A similar theme was what we found with the testing methods. Different types of ambiguous stimuli, not that that's necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think it's a good thing that studies have tested a wide range of ambiguous stimuli or unfamiliar contexts. But what we did observe was that there was no longitudinal data over time to say, how does this behavior kind of change from when a child is 1 year old to when they're 2 years old, for example? Do they still demonstrate the same levels and topographies of social referencing? There was no data that we could find on that. In terms of the overall outcomes here, again, the theme was variation. Quite surprisingly, there were some studies which found that autistic children had lower levels of social referencing compared to their neurotypical peers. But at the same time, there was a study which found the exact opposite effect, in that the autistic children were in fact better on some measures of social referencing compared to the neurotypical children. But overall, when we looked at the summary across the 8 studies, it seemed that the initiation component of social referencing seemed lower in autistic children compared to their neurotypical peers. We couldn't say with much certainty about the discrimination response, partly because almost half of those studies did not measure the discrimination response. So there's not much to say about discrimination at this point. And there had been no attempt to study behavioral processes. And because these studies were all from diverse kind of theoretical perspectives, there were a wide variety of explanations offered for social referencing, from the mood contagion hypothesis, in that children basically mirror the same mood as the parent. If the parent was happy, the child got happy and was just more engaged. And the child was the caregiver was fearful, or frowning, the child basically mirrored their negative modes as well. So that was one hypothesis. And there was a theory of mind, kind of more cognitive hypothesis for explaining differences in social referencing. And there had been no real attempt in the literature at that point to look at stimulus discrimination or operant conditioning within the autistic sample. But it's important for me to highlight here that there have been seminal studies by Martha Pelaez and her lab on social referencing in neurotypical children, and I think also children of parents with depression. But that didn't figure in our review simply because we had a specific demographic category that we were interested in. Right, so armed with some of this information, we summarize the findings of the systematic review as initiation seemed to be lower in autistic children. there seemed to be a lot of kind of interchanging between joint attention and social referencing, no real clarity in delineating the differences when it comes to definition and measurement. And mostly the definitions were quite rigid in their topographical expectations, in that only looking responses were taken as initiations. And yes, no attempt to study either discrimination or operant conditioning as processes that could be contributing to differences in this behavior. So we used some of this information to set up a longitudinal study. So what we did basically was we took 79 children, and these children belonged to one of two groups. So they were either in the typical likelihood group, so that had 36 children in the typical likelihood group. So they had a typical likelihood for autism, and the elevated likelihood group. So these are either the younger siblings of children with a diagnosis of autism, or they were preterm born children. We had 43 children who formed the elevated likelihood group. And so we recruited these children at around 1 year of age. So they were approximately 14 months old when we conducted the first assessment. We assessed all of these children on their social referencing skills, as well as their discrimination learning. So the rate of discrimination learning was another measure. I'll go into detail into each of these measures, but for now, the design itself looked like this. So we measured and assessed at 14 months. We again assessed them at 24 months of age to, kind of capture time as our independent variable. And then at 36 months of age, all of these children, that is all 79, were administered the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Scale, which is sort of the gold standard for autism diagnosis. And the score on the ADOS was basically used as our criterion for classifying these children into one of these three groups. So 36 children were in the TD group or the neurotypical group. So these are basically the same 36 children who had the typical likelihood to start with at 14 months of age. None of them had scored above the cutoff on the ADOS, so they basically formed the TD group. We had 14 children in orange here in the ASD group. So these were children who had an elevated likelihood and who scored above the cutoff on the ADOS, who formed that ASD group. And then we had 29 children in the EL no ASD group. So the EL no ASD group is basically those who started with an elevated likelihood but did not score above the cutoff on the ADOS at 3 years of age. So these were the three groups that we classified them into at the end of the study. And we conducted assessments at 14 and 24 months where we looked at their social referencing behaviors. We measured social referencing typically using remote control toys. So for example, a remote control drone like you see on the screen, a remote control chameleon. That chameleon is actually one of my most favorite toys to play with. It makes some light and sounds, and it can spit its tongue out in a somewhat weird and scary way. But it's a lot of fun, even as an adult, to kind of play with. And we also measured discrimination learning, but I'll show you in a little bit more detail what these measurements look like. So when we measured social referencing, typically the child was always present with a caregiver. So the researcher was not in the room during these measurements. The child and the caregiver were often playing with something very familiar. So it was something like a bus. It could have been blocks. We had a bunch of different toys that were available. And they were playing. And during this time, when the child was playing, there would be an ambiguous toy that's kind of introduced into that play area. So this was typically remotely controlled. So for example, in this case, that could have been a toy like this chameleon that appears. And the toy was activated until the child kind of had paid attention to the toy. But typically the toy produced a lot of light and sound. It was quite hard to miss. And we didn't really have cases where children didn't look at the toy or didn't find the toy. Now, once the child had paid attention to the toy, we waited to see if there would be an initiation response. of some kind. So did the child look at the caregiver? Were there other forms of initiation that the child engaged in? So that's one of the first behaviors that we were interested to measure. Was there an initiation response? And if there had been an initiation response, the caregiver was instructed to provide an effective cue. So we had a screen inside the room which kind of presented an instruction to the caregiver as to what they had to say during the effective cue, and they were trained prior to the commencement of the session to accurately deliver these effective cues. So in this case, the caregiver might have said something like, "Ugh, that's a nasty toy," or whatever. And so once this effective cue was provided, we were then interested in the second response in the chain, which was the discrimination response. Did the child approach this particular object? Did they avoid this object? Did they move closer to the caregiver? So we were interested in what the child really did once the effective cue was provided. And we were generally also interested in the child's latency to respond. So how long after the toy kind of first appears did the child take to make an initiation response, for example? So that's also something we measured during the social referencing trials. And we had 3 trials, so 3 different types of strange looking objects. And we also had to change these objects from 14 months to 24 months of age, because what was ambiguous at 14 months didn't seem so ambiguous anymore at 24 months. So we had to do quite a lot of piloting to identify what types of objects really evoke social referencing responses in children of each age. So the next thing that we measured was rate of discrimination learning. It's a bit of a controversial kind of test, but we really were very tightly bound by our ethics kind of approval. So we had 2 toys, toy A and toy B. So for example, toy A could have been a drum and toy B could have been something that looked like a dog, a musical dog. And approaching toy A was paired with a happy music. So it was a rhyme. It's actually called the Happy Song on YouTube. So when a child touched the object A, that is toy A, a happy music was played. On the other hand, if the child were to approach object B, that is toy B here, we had a loud noise coming up. So this was like a noise of a drilling machine or a blender or something like that. But it was very much within the safe limits of sounds for young children. So we had 20 trials like this. The first 2 trials really just served as exposure trials. So as soon as the child came in, this whole discrimination learning test was conducted by the researcher, in this case me. So as soon as the child came in, we presented these toys one at a time. So toy A was first presented, the drum, and the child was encouraged to touch this toy. And when they touched this toy, the happy music would come along, and I'd sort of sing and dance and do a little silly thing along with the music. And then we'd present toy B, and toy B touching or approaching toy B would lead to this loud noise. So these were the 2 exposure trials. And once these exposure trials were done, we had 20 trials where these toys were presented to the child one after another in a very randomized sequence. And we were basically interested to see how many trials of toy A would the child approach, how many trials of toy B would the child avoid. So we're interested in, did the child approach the toy that was paired with the happy music and avoid the toy that was paired with the loud noise? And we came up with a discrimination index, a score between 0 and 1, depending on the correct responses divided by the total number of trials. So I can show you a video that will make this quite clear. So I'll start with the social referencing trial. So in this trial, you'll see a child and a caregiver playing. When they're playing, new toy will appear. In this case, it's a robot.
Yeah, a robot.
So that was the initiation response. The child looked at the caregiver, provided an effective cue. In this case,
Das Löken? Amai! Amai! Dies Löken? Sagt sie?
And that was the discrimination response, approaching that particular toy in the presence of the caregiver's positive affective cue. So those were the two behaviors that we were interested in, the initiation and the discrimination. For the discrimination test itself, this is the effect that we hope to get. So this is toy A that had been paired with the happy music.
Bravo! Very good! Very good!
This is toy B that had been paired with the loud noise. So that's the effect that we were interested in, to see how many tries did it take for the child to associate toy A with the happy music and toy B with the loud noise. And we did have a final phase at the end of the 20 trials where, we paired both the toys with the happy music. We ensured that the child was playing happily with both and would not, created some kind of aversion towards one of those toys for, as a collateral kind of side effect. Right, so this is done. Sorry, I'm just trying to switch my presentation. I've already done this and this. So these were the results of our longitudinal study. We looked at what social referencing scores look like at 14 months and at 24 months of age for these three groups, the ASD group, the no ASD group, and the typically developing group. And as you can see, the ASD group demonstrated lower levels of social referencing compared to the other two groups at both time points, that is both at 14 months and at 24 months of age. And all the parentheses that you see are statistically significant differences. So there were statistically significant differences between both groups at 14 months as well as at 24 months of age. We found a similar effect for latency in that the ASD group had a higher latency, that is, they took longer to respond to the social referencing trials, during the social referencing trials when they did respond. So this only includes the trials where they did respond compared to the other two groups. But interestingly, what we found when we looked at the social referencing data, two findings that were very important for our intervention study. The first being that the other two groups, that is the no ASD group as well as the TD group, demonstrated some latency to respond. And so expecting children to respond to an ambiguous object with a social referencing response within, let's say, 3 seconds or 5 seconds didn't seem socially valid, because all children seem to be taking a few seconds to, look at the object, explore this object, and then engage in a social referencing response. The other thing is the sort of ceiling effect that we observed almost already at 14 months of age, where the typically developing group is showing nearly 100%. So the total score, highest score that they could get was 6. And you can see that the black line is nearly almost at 6, even at 14 months of age. And so they seem to have a very kind of strongly established repertoire, seemingly already at 14 months of age. The other thing that we got from the discrimination test was that the discrimination index was really quite discriminative of the three groups. So here we found a statistically significant difference between each of these three groups, in that the discrimination index of the ASD group was almost at 0.5. And when you get a score of 0.5, that basically means that they responded in more or less the same way to both toys, that the sensitivity to those contingencies that we put in place, the contingency of the happy music and the social reinforcement and so on versus the loud noise didn't seem to have an impact on their responding compared to the other two groups, which seemed to show some level of discrimination in these contingencies that we had set up. So some of the implications from the longitudinal data is the first thing that we found was there was quite some variation in the topographies of social referencing, especially in the initiation response across all three groups. So children were never simply just using eye contact. Even at 14 months of age, there were some children who didn't use eye contact, but instead would point to the object or would make some kind of a vocalization. At 24 months of age, we saw a lot more language in lieu of the initiation response, and that children would say what, or they would just say look, or they would ask a question, what is that? So there seemed to be a lot of difference in the topography that they used beyond just the eye contact response. There were some children who used the eye contact, but that wasn't the only topography that we found. We also learned a lot about the types of stimuli that evoke social referencing. And the underlying behavioral processes, in this case, the discrimination index, and how sensitivity to environmental contingencies seem to be closely correlated with the social referencing scores, which warrants further investigation. At this point, it's too hard to say if one causes the other and vice versa and so on. I think we have no evidence at this point to suggest that, but we do have some evidence to suggest that this warrants quite some investigation further. Now, I know it's quite, not so traditional to present results from a longitudinal data to behavior analysts, because behavior analysts typically tend to use interventions as the independent variable. Time as the independent variable is not the favorite choice for behavior analysts. But the reason I'm doing this is because I want to highlight some of the advantages that this combination had in the intervention that I'll describe next, to say that sometimes it's worthwhile to break out of the silos that we are in and to kind of adopt cross-domain approaches to research, to share these research questions. If it's not traditional for a behavior analyst to do a longitudinal study, it's also not traditional for a mainstream psychologist to study rate of discrimination learning. And yet combining these two approaches allowed us to explore some questions that had not been explored until this point, and that gave us the freedom and the leeway to look at some of these questions and gain some social validity to the intervention that we subsequently developed. So moving on to the intervention itself. So this was a study with children who had an autism diagnosis. These were autistic children with a mean age of approximately 4.3 years. We had a total of 25 children. And this was a very interesting research design for me because it was a randomized clinical trial embedded with a multiple baseline. So we had children were randomized into one of two groups, either an experimental group where they received the social reference intervention, or the control group where they simply received treatment as usual. And within the experimental group, the intervention was delivered in a staggered multiple baseline fashion. So we had strong single subject data to look at the individual effect of intervention, but at the same time, because it was within a clinical trial, we also had the freedom to look at some of the group level effects of such intervention. And we conducted the study at 6 early intervention centers in the Flanders region of Belgium. And these were all conducted by therapists at these early intervention centers. They were typically speech therapists, logopedists, neurorehabilitation professionals, special educators, and so on, people without much formal training in behavior analysis. So we trained them using a behavioral skills training approach prior to the commencement of the study. And so the entire study, except the pre-test and the post-test, were all conducted by the therapists at these intervention centers. One of the first things that we did in designing the study was to try and identify as many of these ambiguous, unfamiliar materials as we could for each child. So what we did basically was we identified some categories in terms of ambiguous food items, ambiguous toys, ambiguous art materials, and ambiguous instructions. And we put together about 15 ambiguous items in each of these categories, making up for a total of about 60 items per child. And we, provided some surveys and questionnaires to the child's caregiver as well as the therapist to ensure that these objects that we put in that particular child's materials kit were truly unfamiliar and ambiguous to the child. And so there were some minor variations in the list of materials that we used from child to child. This study has now been published in JABA last year, so you have the full list of materials and other information in the study itself. But basically, we define social referencing as a chain comprised of two responses: an initiation response and a discrimination response. And because we'd learned from the longitudinal study about the topographical variations, the latency to respond, we included a wide variety of topographies that children could use. So eye contact was one, yes, but we also included saying, look, pointing, and we kind of tweaked that to each child's baseline performance to say what might be the best option for this child. And we said within 8 seconds of presentation of the stimulus, just to give a little bit more time for the child to look at this object, observe it, and then produce an initiation response. The discrimination response was also again defined like either reaching forward, touching the stimulus, sitting back in the seat. This was again based broadly on what we'd seen neurotypical children do at 1 year, again at 2 years, when they were presented with an ambiguous stimulus. Now, we were interested in the relationship between social referencing and joint attention, simply because, like I was talking earlier, in the systematic review, we'd found that many studies interchange social referencing and joint attention and seem to suggest that one is needed for the other. So we had some measures of joint attention included in the study. We used a standardized scale for joint attention, which is called the Early Social and Communication Scale. It's very popular within mainstream psychology. It has basically two measures. You can measure responding to joint attention or receptive joint attention, and you can measure initiating joint attention. Responding to joint attention is measured using some posters, which we stick in the room, and the researcher basically points to these posters one after another, and we measure whether the child is able to follow the finger pointing towards the poster. For the initiating joint attention, we have a bunch of wind-up toys that are wound up in front of the child, and we see whether the child initiates eye contact with the caregiver, with the researcher, and so on. So we didn't really teach joint attention during the study, but we measured it simply during pre-test and during the post-test. Now, social referencing trial typically looked like this. The child and the therapist were normally engaged in their instructional activities. And in between these instructional activities, their regular therapy session, the instructor would present an ambiguous stimulus. And presenting the ambiguous stimulus typically involved presenting something inside a box or hidden by a white cloth. And then the instructor would kind of open the white cloth or the box to reveal the stimulus to the child. And then the child had the opportunity to engage in a social referencing initiation response. Now, once the child engaged in an initiation response, the therapist would provide an affective cue, either a positive affective cue or a negative affective cue. So a happy cue or a frown cue. We randomized this across the 8 trials that were conducted per session so that we had an equal number of both, so 4 happy and 4 frown. And following the affective cue, we expected the child to engage in a discrimination response. And once the discrimination response had occurred, during the training trials, social praise was provided as a reinforcer. So we didn't provide any additional token reinforcement or other forms of tangible reinforcement, simply because these children were not in a traditional ABA kind of setting, and they were used to performing instructional activities with social praise as a reinforcer. So for the initiation response, if orienting or eye contact was chosen as the target behavior, we used a positional prompt in that the therapist first sat across the child at the face level of the child and then moved slightly towards the right or the left of the child and finally next to the child. So the child was expected to turn their face to look at the instructor. If it was a verbal response like, look, what is this? This was trained using a verbal prompt. For the discrimination prompt, we for the discrimination response, we used progressive time delay, starting from 0 seconds all the way until 5 seconds, depending on the child's response. So for the results, these are the group level results, which I'll talk about first. So the experimental versus the control group. You see 3 panels here. The first panel depicts social referencing. The second and the third panel depict joint attention, that is responding to joint attention and initiating joint attention. So during the pre-test, both groups, that is the experimental and the control group, showed fairly low levels of social referencing. You don't almost see those bars because they're nearly at 0. But both groups showed low to moderate levels of joint attention, both responding to and initiating joint attention. But there was no difference between the 2 groups. The 2 groups were more or less the same to start with. Now, at the post-test, what we found was that the experimental group showed a statistically significant improvement in social referencing. So their scores had gone up to nearly 100%, whereas the control group's scores in social referencing remained almost near 0. But we also found that there was no collateral improvement in joint attention. So the joint attention scores still remained more or less the same as they had during the pre-test. So we didn't find a collateral impact. And this is interesting because we would expect, I think previous research led us to expect that they're related in some way and that you need some amount of joint attention in order to exhibit social referencing. And so therefore strengthening one of these repertoires might lead to improvements in the other. But that was not the case in our study. And there are multiple reasons why that might have not been the case. And I'll go into that in a minute. But before that, the single subject data, if you recall, in the experimental group, we provided the intervention in a staggered multiple baseline fashion. So all the 12 kids in the experimental group, we also had session by session data within the multiple baseline for these. I've only presented 3 of these participants here, P10, P11, and P12. You can see during baseline that they had quite low levels of the initiation response, which is labeled as a looking response here, and low to moderate levels of the discrimination response. So the hollow circles are the discrimination response. And as we provided training, that is the panels that you see in blue, you see a steady increase in both of these behaviors, that is the initiation response as well as the discrimination response. And all participants attained the mastery criterion which we'd set. And during the generalization phase, which is the panels that you see in orange, the behavior was maintained at these levels, and we had a 14-day follow-up during which the behavior was maintained as well. So we supplemented the visual analysis here with some statistical analyses. So we calculated the between case standardized mean difference effect size using the single subject data, and we found the effect size to be high. Now, there are important limitations in the study and important implications. I'll start with the limitations. The limitations are that for a clinical trial, the sample size was fairly low. We had a total of 25 kids only. Typically for a clinical trial, you tend to have more, but the fact that we had a multiple baseline embedded within the experimental group somewhat supplemented that limitation. The other limitation is that as much as our field kind of, celebrates generalization and is important, especially when we teach social behaviors like these, I think when we teach social behaviors, it's as important to kind of specify the circumstances under which we don't want the behavior to occur. So while generalization is as important, I think being clear about when the behavior needn't occur is as important, and that's something we didn't do here, and we should have done a better job of looking at whether in the presence of familiar items that are known to the child, are we still seeing social referencing type initiation responses, and if we were, what would that mean, and so on. So those were some of the limitations. There are still some implications that emerge out of these studies. Theoretically and methodologically, we offered a functional definition that other researchers and practitioners can adopt, include a variety of different topographies and not be limited to eye contact alone as an initiation response. We offer some detail into the types of stimuli that evoke social referencing, to say what kinds of materials may be needed for children at different points during their training and education. And further investigation is needed into discrimination index as a process-based measure to say, yes, we can measure social referencing and say it's present, it's absent, but in order for us to get some sort of an index-based measure, could discrimination index give us some sort of a process-based measure to look into why there may be challenges, and whether strengthening that discrimination, the sensitivity to environmental contingencies, does that then make it easier to train social referencing, for example. Clinically, yes, we offered a method that seems to work to train social referencing in children experiencing challenges, particularly autistic children, like the sample that we used. And we've adopted a bit of an individualized approach based on baseline performance, and also in terms of identifying some of the materials that are specifically ambiguous to each child. And as I was saying earlier, the fact that we didn't see improvements in joint attention makes me argue that perhaps these are functionally distinct repertoires. Like I was saying earlier, it could be that the function of joint attention is to really share interest, whereas the function of social referencing is to disambiguate. And if that were true, then it seems important for practitioners to teach social behaviors according, in a range of or a variety of different antecedent conditions, some that are motivating, interesting to the child, some that are ambiguous, unfamiliar to the child, some that may simply be, a manned type context where the child may want something, and so on. So it seems important to program a variety of different antecedent conditions when we train these early social behaviors, and set our expectations to be socially valid based on measures that are collected with neurotypical children to see what do they actually do in the same type of situation that we're trying to teach our children with special needs. Yes, so finally, some areas for future research. In terms of intervention methods, as I was saying earlier, an intervention package for referential looking that looks at these variety of different functions and topographies. So in the longitudinal study, as I was saying, we found so many different topographies pointing, asking a question, and so on at 2 years of age. And how does this transition kind of happen, and how can we facilitate this transition in children with special needs is one area for future research. And the long-term effects of training, we're actually intended for the intervention study to have a 6-month follow-up, but we completed the study in March 2020, and the schools were all shut, and then was just too late to go back and collect follow-up data by the time we got permission to get back into the schools, unfortunately. I think it would be important also to look at the impact that this has on verbal behavior, derived relations in particular. There have been theoretical arguments about why or how these behaviors could be precursors to more complex language, but we still need some empirical data to support those assertions, as well as documenting prerequisite skills. So if you noticed, all of the children in the intervention study had some amount of joint attention. It was low to moderate, but they still had some amount of responding to joint attention and initiating joint attention. And if I were to guess, I think if I had a child with almost zero joint attention, I don't know if it would be possible to train social referencing, or if it would be socially valid to train social referencing to that kid. So I think some amount of insight into prerequisite skills is needed at this point before, particularly for practitioners to kind of determine when is it a good time to teach the skill, what are some prerequisites that my child might have to have. And then broadly, human development itself, I think the application of behavioral principles during infancy to look at how reinforcement, discrimination, etc., have an impact on infants, their social development, their verbal development, the types of social consequences that we provide, providing a simple general praise statement versus providing an informative statement. What is the impact that these consequences have on behavior? It could be preverbal behavior or verbal behavior, but I think these are some broad questions that are open for the human development domain. And finally, future research in terms of research methods. I already touched upon some of this during the talk itself. So cross-domain approaches, breaking out of some of our silos might be what is needed for answering some of those pending questions. This is by no means a suggestion that all of us kind of, go out and start embracing or conducting other types of experiments or anything of that sort, but it's just the value that I had in combining these approaches, these traditional psychology versus behavior analytic approaches, allowed us to address some research questions that would have been hard to address otherwise. And the other thing that is open for future research is to focus a bit more on person-centered outcomes. It's also a major limitation of my intervention study that we didn't really look at how did this impact on quality of life. I feel like a very easy solution that we had staring at us in our face was to simply conduct one or two parent-child interaction sort of sessions to say pre-test versus post-test. What was the change in the quality of parent-child interaction given this training? And having more of those person-centered outcomes might be the way to go. I have two pieces of work that are currently in press where we discuss how outcomes can be quantified in behavior analysis, particularly at this time where ABA is at a crossroads to say how can we make the findings from ABA more communicable, more easily translatable to professionals and researchers in other fields. And hopefully some of these pieces of work that are in press would serve as a stepping stone or a starting kind of point for those things, to see what the long-term outcomes are, what the person-centered outcomes are to behavior analytic interventions that we provide. So the key takeaways are that babies look for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're in response to us, sometimes to get something that they want, to share interest with somebody else, to disambiguate a novel situation. Social referencing in particular is a chain comprised of two behaviors, initiation and discrimination. And I'm arguing that it is functionally distinct from joint attention. And children seem to exhibit social referencing in several different topographies. So it need not be limited to a particular topography and can evolve over time as well. And it seems to evolve over time, as we saw. And training social referencing typically begins with identifying materials that are unfamiliar to the child. I do think that that really holds the key in that we want to capture that moment where the child really is faced with an unfamiliar event. So then we teach the behavior under those specific stimulus conditions. And then, of course, training both components of the chain while expecting socially valid levels of performance. So that's where the latency piece comes to my mind, that we don't expect all children to kind of see something ambiguous and respond with a social referencing kind of response immediately, that there may be some individual differences. And we saw that there were quite some delays even within the neurotypical children to initiate a response. So those are my key takeaways. I hope you found my talk interesting. I'll pause now for questions and just want to acknowledge all of these incredible people without whom I wouldn't have been able to do any of this work that I've presented today. Thank you all so much for joining and listening. And I'm here for questions now.
Maithri, let me thank you for such an interesting presentation. I think it was not just interesting to me, it's eye-opening. With your research that I am very, very well familiar with, you have opened so many doors. You have allowed us as researchers to make so many questions around what needs to be investigated now. And as the field, as we have in the last 10 years, we have moved towards very early identification of autism or of the likelihood of developing autism later on, because we know that brain plasticity is at its peak at this time during infancy. And so we know that the earlier we get intervention going, the better for those for those kids. So your research has a very high value, of course, as at the conceptual level, just because we learn more about child development per se, but also it has such a high value in terms of the clinical applications that can arise as a result of knowing how these skills develop and how children at a higher likelihood of autism might present them differently or present them at a lower level. So I think your presentation is extremely interesting. So can I, and I think people and colleagues are saying all the same, so can I start with a question myself, and then I will move on to the questions that we have from the audience. I know some of those questions relate to the CU checks, and Mallory from Behaviour Life will take care of that. So if you're on your phone and you have missed those checks, you can do them later on. Okay, so just please read the chat and you will see Mallory's response around that technical aspect. Now, in terms of contents, first of all, I'd like to say that I couldn't agree more with you in that it's not very wise to go from a sunny place to a cloudy place, first of all, which is what you said at the beginning. For your next seminar, we better invite you somewhere sunny and nice, and we have a webinar there. And I think we would also enjoy that. So that's the first. The second that I couldn't agree more with you is that we need to break the silos and of the importance of using the methods that suit our aims and not vice versa. So not using the research methods that we are more familiar with and more confident with. No, breaking those silos and those, habits and traditions, and making sure that the methods that we use can respond the questions that we have. And sometimes those questions are interdisciplinary in nature. So maybe we have to gather, it's a toolbox. So we open our toolbox and sometimes we do research with colleagues. And so then we use those research methods that can best respond those questions that we have. And I think that an excellent example of how we can do that is your use of the combined, like a nested single subject research design within a randomized controlled trial. So which can give you two different sets of information that respond to different but complementary between them questions. Yes. So that I think is an excellent example, and this study is published, so we can read and learn more on how we can do that. So my first question is, how early is social referencing, either initiation or the discrimination that comes after? How early is it indicative, or can it discriminate group membership? High likelihood, low likelihood, and the outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. And from my own research, I think what I'll say is it was already discriminative at 14 months, that the ASD group already had much lower, and there was statistically significant difference. So that's actually the first time, I think, in the published data. Yes, the study's not published, but as far as the published data is concerned, I think the earliest we have on record is 18 months. But it seems like already at 14 months that it's likely indicative of group membership. And so it might be something that is worth doing further investigations into, definitely. And sooner. I mean, now I wish we'd done another assessment at 10 months of age to see if there was a point where it was not indicative. And so we know what that window is. But yeah, I guess that's just hard.
Yes, I mean, yeah, there's, you have a lifetime of research, so hopefully you will find out that in a future study. But because we also do research in that line at Queen's, that question arises from my own work. How early can this be like a red flag? How early can that alert us, either in isolation or in combination with some other skills that we might be measuring, right? Because that's also something that might be, that it's not on its own, but maybe combined with another 3 items that we test or skills, then it's okay. So you'd say at around 14 months, sorry. And from the skills that you tested, is there any other marker that you would feel from your experience, from your data, that is indicative of group membership even earlier, or that you would like to, to test that in future research?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's quite some solid evidence to say that both joint attention and response to name are earlier markers. So almost at 9 months of age, when we see lower levels of joint attention and lower levels of response to name, that those are red flags. And this has been kind of, replicated across labs to say that those seem to be consistent markers. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think that's in line with with what we are finding in our reviews of the literature.
Yes.
Okay, so let me go to the questions of our audience. So there is a question around the toy, the dog. Okay, so the question is, if the child had touched the dog that was paired with a loud noise, how would you have responded? And that's Krista. So Krista is saying, I ask that because the toy plus the happy music was also being paired with your dancing and clapping and praise. So what would you do if the child responded to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I didn't touch on that. So the toy that was paired with the loud noise was also paired with brief inattention. So both the caregiver and I would kind of take our attention away from the child for those few seconds. So the loud noise was typically presented for about 3 seconds. And for those 3 seconds, we would basically turn our face and kind of avert our body away from the child when that was happening. So the consequences were both social as well as the music.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's really clear. So there's another question around the topographies of social referencing. So what other topographies of social referencing, other than eye contact, body turning, etc., would you consider? I think you already mentioned vocalizations, but yeah. So what other topographies would you consider?
Yeah, so I think the topographies vary a little bit with age. At 14 months, what we found was, along with eye contact, the vocalizations and some amount of pointing were the 2 other topographies that we saw. At 24 months, we had a whole lot of other verbal topographies emerge, where along with the pointing, the eye contact, we also saw children saying "look" or asking "what is that?" or saying something else verbal, like giving it a name and so on. So basically, anything more verbal appeared at about 24 months of age.
Okay, thank you. That's clear. And then there is another question. So Michelle asks, was there anyone who actually preferred the loud noise?
That's a great question, Michelle. I think there was one child who preferred the loud noise. We had to drop the data from the study because what we should have ideally done is identified potential reinforcers and punishers before. So we kind of did a blanket thing of all children got the happy music as the positive stimulus and all got the loud noise as the kind of punishing stimulus, which yeah, which wasn't really the most robust way to go about it. So there was one child who actually did prefer, he just found it very amusing that there was allowed drilling machine noise. And we had to drop the data because, you know, it was clear that that was really reinforcing for that child, and it had kind of gone out of our hypothesis of the music being the reinforcer and the noise being the punisher. And we could, I mean, left to me, I would have liked to increase the volume a little bit more, but we were very strictly guided by how loud we could go and so on.
Of course.
Great question.
I mean, sometimes novelty, yeah, that's true. Novelty might be reinforcing in itself. So even if it's a loud noise, that, and then of course there are individual differences. So we can always have a child,
Yes.
a student with a preference we didn't anticipate. But I guess that's one of the advantages of working through the prism of behavior analysis, that what we can individualize the nature of the stimulus doesn't matter. Yeah. So did you drop the data altogether, or would you change the stimulus? You said you just dropped the data, right?
We dropped the data because ideally what we should have done is done some kind of an assessment later to see whether the sound really functioned as a reinforcer. And if it did, then we could have included the data. But since we couldn't do that follow-up, there was no way we could explain that one particular case as a difference, because it was really just that one child. But it really made its way to, you know, the areas for future research section of that paper, where we talk about why a preference assessment before setting up those consequences might have been a wise thing to do.
Yes, and when you do research, that happens all the time. You find out how you can fine-tune your research next time. So that's valuable. Okay,
yes,
that's great. So there are, so Michelle is saying she works in early intervention. Some of your students here, kids, like loud noises. Yeah, I think, Michelle, that's reasonable. Yeah. Okay, so I will leave, as I said before, those questions that relate to the CUs and that relate strictly to the Behaviour Life platform to Mallory to respond to those questions in the chat. So that's us. I cannot see any more questions around contents. So Maithri, thank you very much again for such an interesting presentation. I think we could go on and have 2 or 3 hours per study, and it would be a full day seminar. So maybe we can have you again in the future for a more detailed webinar. But we are grateful for your time and your willingness to deliver this webinar for us today. And so just for everyone in attendance, really, you will be able to watch Maithri's webinar on the Center for Behavior Analysis at Queen's website. It will be openly available without the CUs, but you can go back. And I would also like to know those studies that you mentioned that are in press. So, for example, the one about the biomarkers, I would personally be really interested in knowing which journal, when is it coming out. So maybe you can send me a link to the studies you've published and to the ones that are in press, and I can add those resources for people on the website under your video. Would that be?
Yes, that would be perfect. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. So then we can avail your presentation and we can go straight into those studies and learn more.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure. And thank you, everyone, as well, for tuning in.
Thank you. Thanks to our audience, and thanks a lot, Maithri. So we will see you next month with our next webinar. So have a nice evening, everyone, or a nice day in South and sunny South Florida and sunny Virginia and all those sunny places. So see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, guys.